Constructed languages, or Conlangs, turn up a lot nowadays, like this one. And this one.
Then I shall die as one of them.
And even this one. Conlangs exist for plenty of different reasons, but they can broadly be split between auxiliary languages, they're for helping people communicate, naturalistic languages, for being like natural languages in fictional scenarios, and everything else, although like all things linguistic there are plenty of weird cases and exceptions. Anyway, to give you some more distinctions, you can generally split auxlangs into international auxiliary languages, like Esperanto for communicating between all peoples, and zonal auxlangs, like Interslavic, for helping specific groups to speak, like say, everyone who speaks a Slavic language. There are also these sweet flags for some naturalistic languages which don't really have distinctions, but I animated anyway. And finally, everything else contains languages like engineered languages, designed to fit certain design philosophies, like how Tokipona is designed to be incredibly simple, or how Ithquil is designed to be incredibly complicated. Plus, there are various harder to categorize things like personal languages. With all these categories, you might be wondering exactly what I'm going to cover here. Well, the answer is basically all constructed languages start with similar processes, then vary things up as they go through, and maybe add some extras on the end. People can start building languages from all sorts of places, but generally start with, and warning, here comes the first of many big words, the phonology. A phonology of a language is the sounds in it. This is the International Phonetic Alphabet, and it contains basically every phoneme in known languages. Along the left are the means of articulation. A stop is when you block the vocal tract and then release it violently. A fricative is forcing air through a narrow channel by placing two articulators together. Approximants are the same, but with the articulators further away. So p is a stop, v is a fricative, and w is an approximant. Along the top is the position of articulation from front to back. Labial is with one or more lips, coronal is with the front part of the tongue, dorsal is with the back part of the tongue, and laryngeal is with the larynx. Below them are more specific areas of articulation, like how k and k are both done with the back of the tongue, but k is further forwards, in the velar part. You may also notice that most of these cells have two letters in them. This is what we call a voicing distinction, basically just the difference between p and b, or t and d. With voice sounds, your vocal cords are oscillating from the very start of the phoneme, but with voiceless ones they're not. So p is voiceless and b is voiced. A phoneme is basically just a sound, and they're split into consonants and vowels. This might sound obvious, but remember the ordinary views of consonants and vowels in spelling, and consonants and vowels in how things are actually pronounced, are often very different. Partly because the English alphabet doesn't have one symbol for every phoneme, and partly because English spelling's all over the place. Consider the word rhythm. In English, you could argue there aren't even any vowels, even though the sound I is absolutely in there, and is a vowel sound, as is the sound later on. So here's the International Phonetic Alphabet, which I'm going to shorten to IPA, spelling for rhythm. And before I go into it, I have to add, whenever I pronounce a consonant on its own, I'm going to put an sound after it, because, well, you try and clearly and unambiguously articulate n without the So rhythm is pronounced like r, I, the, m. And that's exactly how it's spelled. Sort of. You might have noticed I've put slashes around the IPA spelling. They indicate that what I've written inside is phonemic transcription, but it isn't necessarily entirely accurate. For example, I've used the letter R at the start, and when writing English, there's no ambiguity as to what it means. But technically in the IPA, the symbol for the sound R is an upside down and back to front R, where a normal R represents the sound R. The unambiguous transcriptions are put into square brackets, with the little line at the top showing the first syllable is stressed and the dot here separating the syllables. So here's the consonant chart for English. There are a few things that might jump out at you immediately. Why are the names on the left changed? Why are there missing rows and columns? Where did these fortis linus rows come from? What's with the 9 different clarification bits? So first things first, people love moving these charts around with new columns and rows, putting things in weird places to make it more compact. This is English's consonants on the original chart. And even if I get rid of the empty rows and columns, you can probably see why they're not made like this. So the chart's simplified like this with some annotations. Fortis and lenis is the difference between strong and weak sounds. Here it's referring to the voicing distinction in English, but it can also be used to distinguish between, say, Mandarin Chinese's aspiration distinction. Plosive and stops are also basically interchangeable words. It's also worth mentioning that whilst all these phonemes exist in dialects of English, this chart only shows the phonemes that make actual distinctions between words. Allophones aren't included, and that is when a sound is produced differently in certain contexts or dialects. So you could analyse r as an allophone of r, as well as overall allophones, like the aspiration distinction between the p in spin and pin. So say you're making a language. Unless it's signed, whistled, or otherwise non-vocal, you'll need to pick out some sounds. But if you want the language to be reasonably human, you can't just pick out sounds randomly. Natural languages, and the vast majority of Conlangs, will display phonological symmetry, which is somewhat hard to describe, but basically, if languages have some sounds in one column or row, they're likely to have more. So phonologies like this appear realistic, but ones like this immediately jump out as weird. There are also some sounds which are far more common than others. Looking back at English, m, n, p, t, and k are all very common, whereas the sounds th and the v, that is with your tongue on your teeth, are comparatively rare. Phonologies also vary in number of consonant phonemes. Around 22 is average, with languages going down to as few as 6, like in Central Rhoticus, which is insanely few, up to ta, which, according to Wikipedia, may have as few as 83 separate click sounds. Bear in mind that's a minimum estimate and doesn't include non-click phonemes. Languages can have insanely many phonemes like this, far more than are in the IPA, with collections of co-articulations and strange additional pronunciation rules. But generally speaking, consonant numbers in the mid-30s is already enough to count as large. Anyway, when making a language you may also want to look into the phonology of languages you want it to sound like. Phonology charts are easy to find online, most languages' Wikipedia pages have them, and the IPA page has clips of almost all the sounds being articulated. Also, I've only shown examples for consonants here. Vowels are more or less the same. Going by spelling, one might think that English only has 5 or maybe 7. There are at least twice that in vowel sounds, but it heavily depends on dialect, so I won't go into them. It is worth mentioning, however, that real 5-vowel systems are quite common, with those 5 vowels generally being e, a, o, and u. And yep, the IPA symbols differ somewhat from what an English speaker might expect from their spelling. For the sake of the video, I'll create a basic phonology. As I said before, m, n, p, t, and k are all common, as are w and the trilled r. From here I could add a voiced series of stops, b, d, g, but that's quite boring, so instead I'll add the voiceless uvular stop, h. We should also add some fricatives. F and s are fairly common, and to be completely symmetrical we could add h and h. But they sound similar and the chart is already fairly symmetrical, so instead let's add h and h. We could also add some voiced fricatives, but instead I'm going to add the voiced lateral fricative y to give the phonology a bit more flair, and because I need it for an example later. Anyway, vowels are also a problem, but like I said before, the 5-vowel system is fairly common, so let's add that first. But these 5 alone are quite boring, so we should add something else. Vowel length, that's how long you pronounce a vowel for, is common, but instead I'm going to add tone, because it's not covered enough in these kinds of videos, and I feel like embarrassing myself with pronunciations. This can work in various ways, register versus contour tones, whether the tone is over a whole word or just a syllable, etc. So let's just model them off of the 4 tones of Mandarin Chinese, which is lazy, but otherwise I'm not going to be able to pronounce it right. So we have and applying over entire words. And for reference, these line things are the IPA symbols for tone. To explain them, basically just follow the left bit with your voice. And before we move on, we need some way of representing these sounds. The way a language represents its sounds is called its orthography. Given we'll be using the Latin alphabet, most are pretty intuitive, like we'll use the letter M for m. K doesn't appear in English, which could make it tough to choose a symbol for, but since the IPA uses the letter Q, and we're not using it for anything else, we'll make it Q. We could do the same for H and make it X, but then again, it might be more intuitive to use H, as they're more similar sounds. On the other hand, if we use H for H, then what do we use for H? Because the dialects of English that have H, like mine, tend to write it with H, like in human. A good way for working out these kinds of problems is to go and look at how the sounds are spelt in other languages using the Latin alphabet, and Wikipedia has examples like this at the bottom of the pages for sounds. So looking at H, we can see common strategies include X, H, and J, J being a letter often used in languages for palatal sounds like the Y in fjord, so we can add J for H and H for H, which leaves Z. Looking at the non-Cyrillic examples on the Wikipedia page, the examples all seem to use L or DL. And this is where we come into the issue of recognizability versus simplicity. Using the letter L for L, at least to me, feels fairly unintuitive, as it doesn't really sound like L, apart from the fact that you're breathing out both sides of the mouth. But on the other hand, introducing a way of writing one sound with two letters, which is called a digraph, makes the spelling less clear. Fortunately for us, we're not using the letters D or L already, so it doesn't introduce any ambiguity. The vowels are fortunately all simple, as we've only got 5, but we've also got the tones to deal with. Since tones apply over an entire word, it'll probably be best to just mark the first vowel in a word with the tone, and have markers that match the contour of the tone. So a rising has an acute, a falling has a grave, dipping has a grave immediately followed by an acute, which makes the shape of a caron, and finally there's the flat high tone, which we could leave unmarked, as some people assume a high flat tone unless otherwise stated, but to keep things nice and clear, I'll mark it with a macron. So now can we start making words? No, we cannot. There is still the Phonotactics, that is the rules governing the possible phoneme sequences in a language. For example, in English we don't allow the sound ng at the start of a syllable, so kang sounds perfectly fine, but nga sounds weird. We also don't allow h at the end of a syllable, together making hang a perfectly normal word, but nga sounds entirely alien. There's also syllable structure. Languages will have a number of consonants in the onset and a number in the coda. English is very relaxed with these things, allowing words like the CCCVCCCC strengths and the VCCCCC angsts. But some languages will limit syllables to just CV, with maybe the occasional exception, like how in Japanese the order is CV outside of the sound n, which is allowed in the coda. So let's just say syllables follow a CCVC structure, where the only clusters allowed at the start are non-approximates followed by an approximant, and only nasals and fricatives can be in the coda. And finally, we can create our first word. Quos. Now I've been trying to cover various basic conlanging methods that apply regardless of language, and how people choose words is heavily dependent on the purpose of the conlang, so I'm generally going to skip over word creation and maybe cover it elsewhere. But bear in mind, natural languages will rarely have all that many root words, and most will be created from other words, even when it's not visible in the modern language. Consider how philosophy sounds like a root word, but if you trace it back through Old French, Latin and into Greek, you get the word philosophia, which I almost certainly pronounced wrong because I didn't look it up before recording this, meaning love of wisdom. And in general, most words will be formed by compounding words, often with one of them transforming into an affix, like the word land, which when attached to the name of a people has slowly differed further and further from being its own word, so that words like England and Finland are generally just pronounced England and Finland. So next, languages need a grammar, and again, the grammar of a spelling system and the grammar of a language are entirely different things. Basically, every language needs strategies for saying everything that can be said, so let's expand our words a little. Ni, Juan. So how do you say, I see the dog? Well, you'll notice we don't have a word for the. Articles like the, a, and an do not exist in all languages. Consider Russian, where the translation for where is the vodka comes back as где vodka, or where vodka. So we could just not have articles, or we could just skip one of them, or we could do something more interesting, like using a demonstrative word or having an affix, like how in Icelandic, cat is köttur, but the word for the cat is kötturin. So we'll say Juan is dog or a dog, and Juanen is the dog. Then there's how we indicate who is seeing the dog. In English, we basically just use the strategy of word order. You know I'm the one seeing the dog in the phrase I see the dog, because I comes before see and dog comes after see. But we also know it because I use the word I, which is in what we call the nominative case, instead of using the word me in the accusative case. If I said me see the dog, it would sound weird because my word order is implying that I'm the one seeing the dog, but my use of the word me indicates that I'm the object of the phrase, the one being seen. Marking for cases, like the I-me distinction, is commonly used and generally done with affixes outside of pronouns, which are commonly used enough to be irregular. Like how based on the rest of English spelling you would assume that my would be pronounced I's or me's, but it's just not. This also applies to other common words, like how you'd never say I eated, because it's common enough to preserve the irregularity of saying I ate. So let's give ni an accusative form, ro, and add an accusative suffix to dog. But wait, dog already has a suffix here. So what if both are used at once? This leads us to the question of whether the morphology is fusional or agglutinative. If it's agglutinative, we basically just glue the suffixes together. So if the definite suffix is en and the accusative suffix is os, the definite accusative would have the suffix enos. If it's fusional though, the two suffixes would fuse into one suffix, like say es, but that's complicated, so we'll keep things agglutinative. So now we have all the words we need and all the morphology we need to form a phrase. So can we say, I see the dog in this language now? Well, kind of, but we should still have some kind of a basic word order, because even if we don't need it, languages with nominative and accusative markings will still generally have a basic word order and move words around from there to change emphasis. This is a list of the most common word orders, and I'm just going to choose VSO because I like it. So finally, I see the dog becomes Vos ni Juanenos. And the countered the dog sees me is Vos Juanenro. Now from here I could talk for hours about the different ways of doing grammar, strategies and ways of talking about everything under the sun. But I've got to cut this video off at some point and I'll cover more in later videos. So if you want to see them, you know what to do. Until then, thank you and Liarkus.